Take your Bibles, if you would, and turn to the book of 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. I'd like to begin read my passage, verse 11 through 17, and then we'll catch us all up to speed on what we're going to be looking at this morning, then get right into it. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11. The Bible says, "Dearly beloved, I beseech you, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lust, which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that, whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king." So we are actually continuing our series in Daniel this morning. So this is a weird place to preach Daniel out of, but I think it'll make sense as we go on. But just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page, we spent last Sunday kind of providing a launch for the book of Daniel. I would just briefly mention the three things that we looked at. We looked at basically kind of the cultural context and look at an overview of the history of the nation of Israel from the time of the kings into captivity for both the northern and the southern tribe in Sunday school. Sunday morning in the worship service, we considered the covenantal context of the book of Daniel and spent time in Leviticus chapter number 26 and dealt with basically God promising them, if you don't obey, I will take you out of the land. And then on Sunday evening in the worship service, we looked at, in the Bible study, we looked at the spiritual context and gave a brief overview of the four major prophets. And I want to take another crack at that, right? Like I feel like I could do better the next time, but as it was, that's where we're at. And so that brings us to this morning, and kind of the context that we're looking at is the practical application. And perhaps even as I orient us all in this direction, you can perhaps see some of the context and some of the thoughts that we're going to draw from 1 Peter, and really wanting to put it squarely in, if I could use the phrase, in New Testament terms for us, right? We're going to spend a lot of time in the book of Daniel and trying to understand everything that he was experiencing, everything that the Lord showed him. But I mentioned this on Sunday, I don't want us to view the book of Daniel as just brave teenage boy against a bad king, right? It's more complex than that. I think it's deeper than that. And I think that this morning helps us kind of apply some of those things to our life. And so we will look at here in 1 Peter chapter 2, and where appropriate, perhaps use Daniel as an example for some of the things that Peter talks about here. I'd like for you to think for a moment this morning, perhaps the feelings that went through Daniel as he woke up for the first time in an alien land. I looked and it was hard to determine a time frame of how long it would have taken him, but at some point he went to sleep in Babylon for the first time and woke up. And my guess is that was a pretty jarring experience for him, no doubt. I don't know how well any of us can necessarily put ourselves in that place, because none of us have ever gone into captivity. We've never been conquered by another nation and brought to serve in their palace. And honestly, I'm concerned that most of us would probably not make it to the palace in that circumstance, right? But be that as it may, we would not find ourselves there. So I don't necessarily want us to spend too much time thinking about that specific context of Daniel, as much as to the point maybe 50 years later, right? Where Daniel has been in Babylon, the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, for quite some time there. And, at this point, he grew up, he was waking up in a place that, to a large degree, felt like home, right? He had been there for the vast majority of his life. It was a place that was known to him. He was no doubt speaking the language fluently at that time without even thinking about it. He probably had business with people that he knew by name there and conducted a job as he lived there. And Babylon, for all intents, became a home to him. And I think that perspective is much easier for us to imagine, putting ourselves in that place of David, I don't know why I keep saying David. If I ever say David and don't correct myself, it's Daniel all morning, right? Without exception. To put ourselves in that place, because we've all been living here our entire lives. And I'm not talking about the United States. I'm just talking about in the world, right? And I realize that there's a sense of like, no kidding, right? Of course we have been. But I am still trying to contextualize and put ourselves in the right frame of mind for this morning. And we're comfortable here, right? We have home here. I have a home, right? Here in a couple of hours when church is over, I'm not saying I'm going to my place of primary residence. I'm going home, right? And really kind of, I would say generally speaking, no matter how sort of a time you've had a house, you would call it home. I'm immediately going home. Even if you move somewhere brand new, that's the term we're going to use. In fact, I was just thinking before earlier this morning, I'm 41 years old, and for like 35 of those 41 years, I've lived in two places. I lived with mom and dad for 15 years. I lived in an apartment for 3 months when I got married, bought the house. And so I'm pretty, home is like one place in my mind, really. And to a secondary extent, my parents' place. Mom asked me a couple weeks ago, do you have a key to the house? I'm like, probably, right? I'm sure I do somewhere because it's home to me. And not only that, is even just in the area, I have people that know me and people that I know that I interact with, not even in the context of the church. I could go through my phone and call probably 100 people, and all of them, when they saw my name likely come up, they would know who it was, and they'd answer and acknowledge who I was, maybe even people I haven't spoken to in a while. And most of them I wouldn't necessarily count as a friend, just an acquaintance, a coworker, somebody that I've met. I speak the language fairly well, right? I'm fluent in English, and I've been here so long in this area that I've got some level of familiarity with a second language that's pretty common here. I don't speak Spanish by any stretch of the imagination, but I understand enough to know what I'm being talked about for the record, right? And I get that aspect of it. And there's a lot of places in the United States where you don't hear Spanish spoken every day. It's not necessarily unique to this area, but it is something that goes on here. I make my money here. I provide for myself and my family. I practice my religion here. And really in a culture that, while it allows it, tolerates it probably is a better term, doesn't really appreciate it a lot of times. I say all that to say this, and my guess is most of y'all could more or less parallel that story with your own. And so really I asked the question this morning is, do you view yourself as a stranger and a pilgrim like you ought to, right? I think from a intellectual point of view, we all know enough of the Bible and understand enough of what the Bible says to where we would use that phrase, I am a stranger and a pilgrim. But boy, are we comfortable here, right? We are very, and there's always a line that probably all of us are going to have to answer to on our own, but that is my concern. It's not that waking up the first morning in Babylon, it's living here for 50 years and allowing the influences of it to have a cumulative effect in our life. Quite possibly, this complacency, this level of comfort lies the greatest danger. Comfort and ease is a dangerous place. For example, when I'm at work, I'm a lot more aware of what's going on around me, a lot more careful of what I'm doing because and it's not me isolated. I work in a fairly dangerous place. Brother Reynolds just taken to ask me every week or so, have you burned anything down? And you know why he asked me that? Because we're burning stuff down pretty often, right? And I'm acutely aware of that. You walk through units and it smells like gasoline, right? Like this is a place that things can go wrong in. But when I'm working at home, my level is probably lower than it ought to be perfectly honest. The whole redneck safety glasses, just squint, right? It'll be all right? Nothing's going to happen to us. And because I'm comfortable working at home, I'm not worried about a safety guy showing up. I'm not worried about things blowing up in my face, right? It's a comfort level that we have. Comfort is only good if you're in a safe place. And I want us to kind of wrap our minds around the fact, living in the world, we are not in a safe place. We are not in a place that we can let our guard down and not be cautious in. I don't want us to get so comfortable here that we forget that we are in a foreign land. I don't care if you have a birth certificate from the state of Texas, you are in a foreign land and you ought to view your life as such. So even as we are involved in this life and active, we don't want to forget how we are. And I think Daniel really does kind of paint us a pretty good picture of how you can be in a country and even in one sense taking part in it at even a fairly high level and still being dedicated to your God. It's still being separate from the corruption that goes on around you. I just don't want us to forget who we are, where we are. If I could just back up momentarily before we launch into the message, I would use verse 9 and 10 to kind of set us in our context. We're not being spoken to outside of a context. And the context that Peter puts it in is he calls us a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, a people that have been called to sow the praises of God who has called us out of darkness. We're the people of God. We've obtained mercy, and that ought to color the way that we live our lives. It ought to affect the way that we respond to the world around us. It ought to affect the way that we interact with the world around us, because we're not from here. We're not staying here. And you know, you've ever gone on, everybody's been on vacation, gone out of town or something. You ever go into a motel room, and I've noticed this, like a lot of times I'll have a dresser with drawers. I'm like, who stays in a motel long enough to put their stuff in a drawer, right? Like I'm sure that people do know that, but you know why? I've never put my stuff in a drawer at a motel. You know why? Because I don't plan on being here very long. Even if I'm there a week, I'm still probably not putting for a lot of reasons, right? Putting my stuff in a drawer, right? And that's that we know what it is like to view something as temporary. And I'm concerned that we don't view the kind of the home part of our life as temporarily as we should. So look at these verses with me just very quickly. Verse number 11, we see the war within us. He says again, follow along with me. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against your soul. The war against us. So it is a plea that he is. And he starts out, and I think that this is important. Don't want to just necessarily skate past it, but he calls them dearly beloved. And that is imparting, in fact, more. He's not just coming to lay down the law. I mean, he is Peter, and so it's not that he doesn't have that authority, ability, capability, but he's approaching it from a different perspective than that. We ought to appreciate it. He's not standing over us as a domineering taskmaster. Again, not saying that there's never a time and a place for that. I'm just talking about the context here. And he's saying, dearly beloved. He's showing them affection before he reveals some things to them. And it just really shows the import. You know, you ever had a serious conversation with somebody, right? I've had serious conversations with my daughters. And even, especially if I've planned it and sweated over it, like, all right, I'm gonna have to talk to him about this, right? And I go and I would never start the conversation with dearly beloved daughter, right? It would make it awkward right off of the bat. But even if I don't use that King James-esque language, that's 99% of the time the tenor in which I'm approaching it. I've had serious conversations at work. I don't typically start those with dearly beloved either. It's more like, Now see here, partner, right? Right? And so, but depending on who I'm talking to, but really what this phrase, dearly beloved, imparts to us, is that he's speaking from a place of concern, of love, and wanting the best for us. He moves on to, I beseech you. This is, again, not a command. I say that, and don't take that to mean you don't have to do what he's about to tell us. But a lot of times you can say a command in a suggestive way, right? And you know, it's always better if people kind of come around to it on their own. No doubt that sometimes we can tend to be a little slow, but he's saying, I'm begging you of this. I'm asking you to do this. And really a lot of what he talks about here is just for your own good, right? I want you to respond in such a way. He's beginning with affection. He's really not talking to people. Let me put it like this. He's not talking to negligent soldiers that need to toughen up. He's more talking to struggling saints and loved people that he loves, right? And again, it's immediate to this context, right? You know, the Bible doesn't have any qualms about telling people to toughen up, but that's not what's going on here. And I think that really what we need to think as we think about this idea of strangers and pilgrims, it's really not an easy thing to be. Being a stranger and a pilgrim. But I would also argue it's not something we do by accident. The beseeching really imparts to us the urgency. This isn't something that you could say, well, I don't really feel like doing it. You are kind of living the role. The question is how good of a choice, how good of a job are you doing? What does the word strangers and pilgrims mean? Let me put this at the outset. I'll define them, illustrate them, and then I'll come back to where I'm starting right now. These are not These are complementary terms. They're not even really trying to tell us two different things. They're more or less two words imparting the same thing, if that makes sense. Let me define them. The word stranger comes from the Greek word parakios, and I'll tell you why that matters in just a second. And it may not even matter that much after I tell you, but I'll say. So the word describes a resident alien. We're familiar with that concept, right? It's a pretty big deal. Just from a political standpoint, we don't. We want people to be here legally, and that's true. But we need to understand we're not even here permanently, right? From my perspective, I ought to view myself as a resident alien, not in the United States. Really, countries have nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about living here in the world. It carries this idea of someone who lives alongside the native population but does not possess native citizenship or full standing in that country. We understand what that means. The word parakios, it comes from two words, para, which is beside, I think Brother Jeremy, he touched on it, parakleos or something with the comforter right at the beginning. It's that same idea, to beside, and the okios is house. So it's somebody that lives beside the house, right? And it's someone that has an address, someone that works there, participates in orderly life, but it's not native to the country. So stranger emphasizes, this word stranger is emphasizing status and belonging. This concept right here, I live here, but I'm not from here, right? And the problem with that is there's a very practical sense in which I am from here, right? Because we became strangers and pilgrims in the same place that we weren't strangers and pilgrims, right? And so this really requires some mental discipline on my mind. When we got saved, and this isn't really a salvation delivery from that perspective. Somebody don't get saved and say, now you understand you're a stranger and pilgrim now, right? I don't think it really works like that. But there's a very real sense in which once you accepted Christ as your Savior, you're no longer from here. In fact, I would even argue your place of origin isn't even from here anymore. It's not, we think of stranger and you think of people that we don't know. It's really not so much somebody that you don't know. It's just somebody you're not like as far as that goes. He's describing someone living in a country where he's not a citizen, and we're not citizens here. The word pilgrims, it means residing temporarily in a place that is not his native home. It's used of a person who comes from another country and stays among the local population without treating that place as his permanent homeland. So pilgrim emphasizes temporary residence, right? We're not planning on being here forever. And there's a sense in which none of us are going to be here forever, but me for really going to be here forever, right? We're planning on, this is not our home. In fact, we sing the song, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through." I feel like there's a song with pilgrim in it. Now, that song was fitting. That's not the song I was trying to think of, right? But there's a temporary aspect of it. And you know what? I'll go back to the illustration of the motel room. The reason we don't unpack in a motel room, please tell me you're not unpacking if in a motel room if you're only there for a couple of nights. Okay, everybody shake your head. Amen. We don't do that around here, right? And so, but the reason you don't do that is because I'm not going to be here for very long. I have no intentions. Now go home and look at your house. And it's at least possible to argue that you sure look like you're standing around for a while, right? It's very easy to do that. And I'm not saying that means you have to live in a shipping container with plywood walls. There's some benefits to that, but that's not really the point here. So a stranger is, I live here, but I'm not from here. Pilgrim is, I live here, but I'm not staying here forever. So you may even live in one place for 80 years, own property, raise a family, work a job, serve your community. But you understand my situation here is still temporary. This is not where I'm at. And so again, I would reiterate, the words overlap considerably. He's not establishing two different classes of people. He's combining near synonyms. Peter's combining near synonyms to give one picture of what is going on here. So stranger is describing his relationship to the present country. Pilgrim is describing the temporary character of his thing. So what is the first thing after we have established who I am, a stranger and a pilgrim, what should I do? Verse 11, he continues, he says, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. Okay, so we're just stepping right off the deep end, right? We're just no launch up, no ramp up, just straight to the point here. What does the word abstain mean? And so the word abstain means to hold oneself away from something, to keep oneself at a distance, to refrain deliberately. And so when he says abstain from fleshly lusts, he basically means make sure the bad things about the world that you're living in stay at arm's length, right? Make sure that you're pushing back against the encroachment of the world. The emphasis here is on a person who is actively holding himself back. And again, don't mistake this to mean that a Christian should never leave their house. It's a matter, I would point out here, it talks about abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. This is more of an inward thing than an outward thing. There are 100% for sure an outward manifestation of it, but really the first battle we have to fight is in our hearts and in our souls and in our mind. If you lose the outside battle, you lost the inside battle quite a while ago. So the best thing to do is take care of it on the inside, and the outside, to the greater or lesser extent, will take care of itself. And this is important. I want to make sure we understand this idea of abstinence, this idea of abstaining is not incidental or accidental. It is intentional, right? This isn't just something that we kind of go through life and it just kind of happens. These are decisions that we're making on the inside of I am going to keep some of this stuff at arm's length. And Hebrews, I think it's 11, maybe 12, that talks about, we're pretty close to that. Hebrews 12:1. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset. There's two categories there. I don't want to get too far. It kind of to my mind. But there are sin that's kind of obvious, but there are also things that are just weighing us down that also we should keep at arm's length. And I'm not so sure that most of those are what we ought to be more concerned with than sin. Take that in the context I'm speaking of, right? Because weight is insidious in the fact of it's not in the sin category, but it can still be damaging to us. And we need to be aware of this. And Peter is not saying here, keep fleshly lusts under reasonable control. Have you ever tried that before? We're going to try to manage this. We're going to try to work with what we have here, right? We're going to try to do it. He says, keep yourself away from them. And this is a pretty difficult expectation that's been given to us because, all y'all been living here a while. This is something that takes constant attention and awareness and effort with. One thing I always is interesting to me. I don't know what everybody uses to listen to music or if you even listen to much music, but Apple Music is the algorithm is literally influenced by the wicked one because you can have it on what's called Caleb Station, right? And it basically kind of takes everything that's in your playlist and says this is stuff you'd like. And every once in a while they put a song like, you ain't looking at my playlist because this song is nowhere near anything I have ever listened to, right? And the thing is, it's like, well, let's see if he listens to it. Let's see if they'll entertain it. Let's see, and we have to be on guard against that. We have to because the devil, the world is always saying, let's try it. Let's see what we can do. Let's see how much we can pull them in. What does the word lust mean? It's the desire, craving, appetite, the inward impulse. And he doesn't simply say here, abstain from sinful actions. He says abstain from fleshly lust because this is where all the problems always start. You listen, temptation may present itself without permission. Abstinence refuses to give it hospitality. And that's the responsibility we have. And the danger is, think about it. If you moved to another country, Mexico would probably be too easy because we've got a large Hispanic population here. You could probably go live in the valley, right, McAllen or something, and you wouldn't hardly be able to tell a difference much, right? But let's take a completely different country, pretty foreign. Let's think Eastern European. Let's go with Bosnia, right? We're moving to Bosnia, right? And probably not many of us are very brushed up on whatever they speak in Bosnia, some sort of Eastern European dialect of something, right? And probably a lot of their mannerisms and customs are going to be foreign to us. But let's be real. You live there for 20 years and you look and sound and talk and act like one of them, generally speaking, right? Unless you've made a pretty dedicated effort to keeping the Texan alive, right? That would go away with it. And so we can imagine there. I mean, it's this idea of, a child is adopted at a young age or something, and he grows up in a different culture in a different country, and he identifies more with where he spent time than perhaps he would where he came from, right? And so we all understand just the practical, physical realities. If you spend a long time in one place, there's influence on you. It's influencing you. And the Bible says, be careful. He says be careful about it, really more strong. He says abstain from fleshly lust. The Bible does talk a lot about this. I can't spend a lot of time. Let me just kind of give you the verses and the words. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, it says to flee lust. And James 4:7 talked about resisting the devil. And Titus chapter 2 talks about denying worldly lust. And Mortify 8:13, Romans 8:13 talked about mortify, in case you couldn't tell that. Colossians chapter 3 talks about putting things off, making no provision. Romans 13:14, making no provision, right? And so the Bible is all throughout it is saying, be careful about what is on the inside that wants what's on the outside that you should not have. And Peter is driving the point home from here. He's like, you shouldn't want this because you're not even from here anymore. Your desires, your wants ought to be different. They ought to be changed. And he's saying that they're still coming after you, but you get to make the choice on how much you do. I would argue living in this world, at least on a limited level, one of the greatest dangers is not so much around us as it is what's in us. And this is where we have to fight the first battle in our fight. Listen, if you get comfortable when you should be cautious, that's not the world's fault. That's your fault. That's our fault. Verse number 12, we see the witness before them. It says, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. The integrity in our conversation, having your conversation honest. Listen, and I think that this is maybe an aspect that's somewhat going out of style, but man, we ought to just do what's right. We ought to do what's right. This idea of having your conversation honest, that's the terminology I would use. We're just going to do what's right. We're going to do the right thing. And really, more importantly, we're going to do the right thing in the face of pressure, right? We at work, a lot of people are at least would be familiar, even if you don't work in the industry, you're familiar with the terminology. It's like if you're doing something, you're working or whatever, and safety is standing there, right? I mean, and not necessarily for you, but they're just observing your job. They're standing there. I don't know a person in the world that doesn't act a little bit different. I know people that quit working, right? Like, they'll walk off eventually, right? It's just not worth it, right? And they're changing the way that they act because somebody is watching. And you can escalate that up. I walked up to a job the other day, and marathon safety was standing there. I know him. His name is Brad, and pretty nice guy, right? But Brad brings a certain level of tension to a job, and not necessarily because of who he is or what type of person, but just he's marathon safety. This matters. A site manager walks up to a job and everybody gets real safe. Right? We understand all of that. But really the problem is if you can identify with that concept and you quit doing what's wrong only because someone is watching, well, you're not really interested in doing what's right. Work is one thing. I'm not advocating or intimating, inferring or anything that you ought to not follow the rule at work. But it is one thing. But we ought to be willing to do what's right even when it's difficult, even when nobody is watching, because I'm not doing what's right because I'm worried the pastor may get a hold of me. I do what's right because this is what I expect of myself. This is what God expects out of me. We do what's right in the presence of enemies. And even more importantly, if I could put a fine point on it, we do what's right in a world that can't even define right. We have to still do what's right. And really, because we're doing right by a higher standard. So we're going to have our conversation. Our life is going to reflect honesty. The second phrase there, among the Gentiles. And this is important because we're not amongst friends. And I'm not talking about individuals. I'm just talking about, if you will, kind of the system, the world in which we live. We're not amongst friends. Number one, I would argue this is why church is so important, because you kind of need friends to kind of help support you, right? That matters for that reason. But, the idea of, I don't watch hardly any, I don't watch sports, right? I watch football on Thanksgiving because my brother-in-law watches football on Thanksgiving, and it's fine. I don't have a problem with it. I may watch baseball in the World Series type deal, but I am also aware enough of sports to know that home field advantage matters. People like playing at home in front of a favorable crowd. In fact, I feel like football may be a bigger deal with this. Stadiums get exceedingly loud when the opposing team's offense is on the field. It cuts down on communication. They can't hear each other talk. It's just adding to it, right? And then when the home team is on the field with the ball, it can get relatively quiet just because they don't want to mess their own team up, right? So there's the home field advantage. Well, I got news for you. We're not on our home field, right? We are playing. I'm carrying the analogy. We're playing ball in a place that's not hospitable to us, right? We're talking Philadelphia level throwing batteries at players on the field like this. We are not living in a place that's hospitable to us. And really what's even worse is we're dealing with people who want us to be more like them. Let me pull up a reference from Daniel. We'll be looking at it shortly, probably next Sunday. I say probably, Lord willing, next Sunday night. But this whole idea when they got there, remember everything they wanted to do. They wanted to teach them the language, wanted to teach them the customs. They wanted them to eat the food. Right? They're saying, we want you to be like us. It's hard to stand in a culture that's saying, be like us. Do what we're doing. Reside and act and interact with the world the way that we're doing. Really, we need to understand we're not at home. We're strangers and pilgrims, and we ought to be acting like it. You see, he talks about, and still in verse number 12, that whereas they speak against you as evil doers. Let me give you a couple of references. Daniel, I do think, helps us with illustrations in this form. Daniel chapter 6, it'll be a month or so plus before we get there. It says, then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault in him. For as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. I just would like to put the question out. If somebody was looking at your life, trying to find something that you were doing wrong in order to make an issue out of it, would they have to look very hard? Would they have to pry? How long would they have to watch you before they could go, aha, look at what he did. We can go tell this person. We can go tell that person. Or I knew that, right? How long would they do? And really what it illustrates is Daniel was faithful in his duties, free from corruption, competent in his work, blameless in his public conduct. That's the standard we ought to want for ourselves. And then you know what they said in verse number 5. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Let that be true of us. I know for myself personally, I do try to do a good job at work. I'm the only one that kind of does what I do, and I have a high standard for myself. I'm not perfect by any stretch, but I try to take care of my business. And to such a level of, if they're ever going to complain about me, it's going to be that I don't work on Sundays. If they're going to come and bring a charge against me work-related, he won't show up on Sundays, no matter what, when it comes right down to it. And listen, that's in one sense. Oh, my tablet's wanting to do all sorts. And that's a standard that I hold myself to, right? I was talking to a guy, I mentioned it to Dad. The guy's like, I was talking to him yesterday. I said, you need anything tomorrow? I'm not going to be here. He's like, well, I don't want to show up tomorrow. I said, well, you know one person that won't care if you're not here tomorrow? Me, because I ain't going to be here, right? And another guy's like, he said, I'm going to start going to church. He says, if you don't have to work on Sundays. I said, nothing will make a religious person better than something in it for themselves, huh, bud? Right? Like, yeah. And you know what? But listen, that ought to be our goal. If they're going to find something wrong with me, they're going to have to pick up their Bible, right? Does that make sense? They're going to have to go say, how does he worship God? And can we find a point of conflict with that in the life here? They couldn't condemn Daniel for doing evil, so they redefined his faithfulness to God as evil. I'm just concerned for myself, and probably you ought to be concerned as well, that somebody wouldn't have to look that hard for most of us, that they wouldn't have to dig that deep. And in the same chapter, it says, they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, which is the children of captivity of Judah, regardeth thee not, O king, right? They were emphasizing that he was a stranger and a pilgrim, right? They don't say that Belteshazzar. They called him by his Hebrew name and talked about how he was from Judah, right? They were illustrating. And listen, Daniel had a pretty rough row to hoe, right? He had a difficult things that he went through. But Daniel sets the example of this is how you live in a pagan land that's against God and still stand for the truth. And so when we come here and he talks about that they speak against you as evildoers, that it may be your good work. And I would say this Daniel paints a picture for us, and that's what I want in my life. They're going to have to find a problem with my religion if they're going to find a problem with me. The power of our conversion. You see what it says at the end of verse number 12, which they shall behold. But they may buy your good works, which they shall behold. Glorify God in the day of visitation. We ought, listen, as strength, listen, think about it. Let me kind of put it into a political context without being political for the sake of being political. Listen, if you were from another country, or let's say you went to another country, listen, you ought to follow their laws. You ought to do what they do. You ought to, when in Rome, do as the Romans. I don't really know how far you want to take that, but you understand what I'm saying. You ought to not. And basically I'm saying, you're a United States citizen. Maybe you ought to represent a little bit, right? Don't go over there and start causing troubles and taking part in protests and getting yourself arrested and causing trouble. You're an American citizen. Act like it when you're, to the point where if somebody interacts with you in a foreign land, whatever they think about you is probably what they're going to think about the United States of America. And again, I'm using a political example. In the overall scheme of things, maybe it doesn't matter that much, but that ought to matter to you a little bit. But think about it from a spiritual perspective. If you're a stranger and a pilgrim, citizen of heaven, you realize most of the people that interact with you, what they think of heaven, what they think about God is what they think about you. That's the concept that they have. And so he talks about here at the end of verse number 12, that they may buy your good works, which they shall behold. That means you have to have them to behold them, right? You can't. It's not that your good works, which they may assume. They're seeing this. It says glorify God in the day of visitation. Like, has that? You ask the question. Does that happen? Like, what's the likelihood? Let me go to Daniel with me. It's chapter 6. I want you to see this with your own eyes. Daniel, chapter 6 and verse number 25. Then King Darius, Daniel 6:25, then King Darius wrote unto all people, nations and languages that dwell upon the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. In his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Okay, I don't know that I'd go quite so far to say that I think Darius got saved here. I don't really know that you can infer that much beyond that. But at bare minimum, you know what he did? He glorified God on the day of visitation because of something that Daniel did. Our desire ought to be that when people see what we're doing, when they behold our good works, that we're not being bashful of, that we're not hiding, that they say, it's got to be God. Because there's no human way that this could be possible. So in verse 12, we see the witness before them. Verses 13 through 16, we see the submission required of us. So he kind of begins to turn a corner and really gets pretty practical with us and for us. He says, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be, I'm going to read a few verses here, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, and not using your liberty as a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God. Verse number 13, we see the practice of submission. He's basically saying, wherever you find yourself as a stranger and pilgrim, you should do what you're told. You should do what you're told. Remember, we're viewing it from a position of not I'm an American citizen, right? I'm viewing it from the position of I am a stranger and a pilgrim and a Christian, and I want to represent that appropriately where I live. I don't care if it's Texas. I don't care if it's Mexico. I don't care wherever you find yourself in. The goal is not anything other than when people think about me, I want them to see my God. And the way that you act and behave yourself matters in that sense. It says, submit yourself to every ordinance for the Lord's sake, of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme. Should follow the rules. Should follow the rules. And think about Daniel as the example. I'm going to kind of just recount things to you because I don't want to get we don't have time to spend a lot of time in Daniel. We'll be there later. But Daniel entered their civil service program, for lack of a better term. He submitted to Babylonian education. language instruction, administrative training. He served within a pagan king's government. He didn't reject everything Babylonian simply because it was from Babylon. But let me kind of counter that. He learned their language and literature without accepting their idolatry. And really, this is where the difficulty kind of resides. Is I think it's in 1st or 2nd Corinthians. It talked about in the world but not of it, right? And this kind of striking this balance of realizing I'm living here. I'm having to engage on some level without becoming one of them, without becoming identical to them. Really, we need to be careful about not confusing cultural difference with moral compromise. And moral compromise, we all know Daniel's story there. And not only that, it's interesting, he tolerated their name, the name that he gave them. Daniel's new name carried pagan associations, but Scripture doesn't require him saying, "You will call me Daniel." He took the name. Now, when he's writing about himself, he writes Daniel, but you don't find no recording of him insisting that they call him by his Babylon. He could not control what Babylon called him, but he could control whether or not Babylon defiled him, and that was really the bigger issue here. Really, and this is important, yielding where Babylon, let me make sure I get this right. He yielded where the matter concerned Babylon's treatment of him. He refused where the matter concerned his obedience to God, right? Listen, I'm in here, I'm engaging in the world. I think that you could make a compelling argument. This articulates a Christian, I'm going to use the term right, that may be overly stating it, Christians' right to partake in government and politics and everything, but you have to be careful that you don't become one of them even while engaging with them. Not only that, we see also as we think about this idea of submitting yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, he requested exemptions rather than staging rebellions. Right out of the gate in chapter 1, they came to him and said, "You're going to do this, you're going to do that, you're going to do this, you're going to do that." I am inclined to think, because of the way the rest of the book turned out, Daniel was willing to die over what was about to happen. I can't prove that there. Maybe he gained some fortitude. But at any rate, if you go back and read the verse, and we'll be there, so I'm not finding it necessary to go and read every verse right now. It uses the phrase that Daniel requested, right? He requested this. He didn't insult the officer. He didn't say, "I am a Hebrew of the tribe of Judah, the servant of the living God, and I'd rather die than eat your food." The guy would be like, "Works for me, dude." Like he probably wouldn't have cared one little bit. We brought a lot of y'all. We figured some of y'all were going to be idiots, right? I don't think that. And so his manner of speaking, the way that he interacted, really he was respectful. Every interaction you find with him, you remember, I may have it somewhere. I'll mention it right here. When I think it's chapter 2, where basically I think it was Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, comes and knocks on the door and says, "Hey, we got to come on, we're going to kill all y'all," right? He's like, wait a minute. Hold up, right? Let's talk about what's going on here. But even then, he didn't, barricade himself in the room and say, "You're gonna have to send more than one guy to come." He never responded like that, even when dealing with pagan kings who could have had him killed at any point. He didn't insult the officer. He didn't publicly denounce Babylon. He didn't act as though the prince of the eunuchs had no authority. Right? And he could have said, it's the whole, and you say, well, where's the line at? It depends. And I only say it depends from the perspective of the circumstance matters. I can't sit up here and hypothetically tell you every last place where you fall on one side of the line or the other. What I can say is the example of Daniel is to the very nth degree, you give deference and humility and submission everywhere you can. And then if it gets to the point where they're throwing you in the lions, then at least they feel bad while they're doing it, right? At least make it to such a point where if they feel like they have to do this to me, they're going to feel bad during the process. You could read, I went all over the place for a second, but let me go back to, so he had a method. And what I would say is he was respectfully working through the authority structure, right? He was working through it, and he had humility. He talked about thy servant, I beseech thee, as thou seest, deal with thy servant. And this is important. I think I really want us to get it from this message this morning, and definitely from as we move into the book of Daniel, that your conviction can be immovable, but your manner does not have to be belligerent. Those are two different things. And it's the whole idea of you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. I don't have any idea if that's true. I've never Flies are not attracted to honey from my experience, but at any rate, but you understand, the way that you respond and interact, it makes a difference. Biblical courage does not require you to have an insolent attitude. And we need to understand, as strangers and pilgrims, that's a kind of a place that it ought to provide some humility to us. It doesn't say you're kings and potentates in this land. You're strangers and pilgrims. Also, Daniel did a good job. Let me give you this quote, part of a verse. He found them 10 times better. That ought to be our desire. I want to serve God, and I'm going to be 10 times better than the world around me. He respected. I mentioned that about when Arioch came. He was respectful at that situation. He submitted. You realize when Daniel was about to be thrown into the lion's den that Daniel didn't fight and scream and argue the point the whole way. Yeah. Demand his rights. Say, well, where's the line at? I don't know where the line's at. There was an example just to give the other side of it where Paul's like, is it lawful to beat a Roman uncondemned right? So I'm never saying to never invoke a right that you have. But even Paul, right? Even Paul, when he said that, even the way it's written, I mean, you can maybe read arrogance into it, but I don't think that naturally comes from the text. You just, hey, I got a question, right? And asked it. And so there's a time. But a Christian never has a right to be belligerent and insolent and aggressive to people that are in charge of us. Say, well, I don't think they're right. Yeah, Daniel probably didn't really like living in Babylon either, if it comes right down to it. You think that Paul loved living under the Roman Empire? I mean, we can kind of give a list of people that kind of had it probably worse than us when it comes to government overbearing on us. What time is it? We probably should move on a little bit. I do want to spend a few minutes in verse 17. Let me just give you this and then we'll move on. A couple of key thoughts. He submitted without surrendering. He served without assimilating. And he obeyed until obedience became disobedience to God. And I think that captures the idea. I'm just going to say 13, and we're going to have to move through 14, 15, and 16. But submit ourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. Not because it's right, not because it's justified, not because everything is equitable, but I want to be a good testimony for my God. I'm going to submit to that. 14, or under governance, it's kind of a continuation of the thought from 13. Verse number 15, the point of submission. For so it is the will of God that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of evil men. I've referenced how while Daniel's conduct did not prevent him from foolish men from speaking, it just made them appear foolish when everything was said and done. Verse 16, again, quickly, we'll spend a few more minutes in verse 17, so that's where we're headed. The purity of submission, as free, not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God. And David was a political captive, but from a spiritual perspective, I think he considered himself free. But even in his spiritual freedom, there's a sense in which there's always a choice, right? You always got a choice. Now, choices are always associated with outcomes and consequences, but you always have a choice on what you're going to do. And what I would say here is from a spiritual perspective, you can do whatever you want to spiritually. But we also have to understand that you shouldn't use your spiritual freedom as a cloak to undermine the rightful and duly instituted government that's above you. Daniel, I think, gives us a very good example of someone who lived in a horrible place against God and prospered in it and was successful in it. Verse number 17, we'll just spend a few minutes here, obviously, at the end. So, he says, honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. You probably should memorize that verse. It won't be that hard, right? But this is a good, can I use the term mantra, for us to have in our life as we think of, because there's not hardly a situation, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, kind of on the fly. I can't fathom a situation looking at this that one or more of these would not apply to. You ever get pulled over and you felt like the cop walked up to your vehicle with an attitude? Maybe not. I mean, not necessarily all the time, but that's possible. You say, well, so then you have a question. What should I do? Well, I wonder if this has anything to do for it. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Well, for starters, fear God kind of covers every situation, right? So I definitely, whatever I'm about to do in this situation, I have to fear God, right? Well, then it also says honor the king. Now I know we don't really care for kings round about these parts, but I think that we can still appreciate what he's talking about here, because kings, especially in this time, it was representative of just government in general. This is kind of, there was no really democracies. The Roman Republic, I don't know that I would call that much of a republic for very long. But what he's saying, so when you have an officer come up to your window, the thought that should be in your mind is honor the king. Honor the king. Honor the king. Fear God and honor the king. When you're at work, you ever been at work and somebody anger you, right? Annoy you, frustrate you, and you're inclined to give them a piece of your mind? Probably, I've heard it said, don't do that. You ain't got enough of it to be passing around, right? Right. So we don't want to be doing that. And what could govern this? Well, I ought to fear God. Listen, if this every interaction when you felt fleshly lust, which war against the soul, kind of rising up within you, ask yourself, how do I fear God in this situation? And then you ask yourself how does he put it? How can I honor all men? Whatever's going on in front of you, how can I honor this person? How can I give honor to this person? How can I fear God? So honor all men. What does this mean? Well, I think primarily it means recognizing other people's human dignity. As humans, all of us are created in the image of God, and at a bare minimum, that requires a certain level of respect that we offer to everybody, no matter what they're doing. It means we treat him, her, the other person with civility and fairness. Again, I think that Daniel is just an amazing example of this, where he's in a position where people a lot of times were fairly aggressive with him. Can you imagine getting a knock on the middle of your night and say, your coworker messed up real bad, so we're killing you too? What are you talking about, dude? This is not a good way to run anything, right? And you never once find Daniel responding. I'm over here. I'm talking Daniel up pretty good. Probably will for the next 13 weeks. I am under no false illusions that Daniel was not a perfect man. But what we do find is a pretty good revelation of how you're supposed to respond to negative situations. And I think we can learn that. Treating people with civility, refusing contemptuous or degrading behavior, rendering appropriate respect to office or relationship. It doesn't mean you have to approve of every bad thing somebody does, right? I mean, that's not talking about that. It says it's being respectful to people that are around you. Listen, as a Christian, you ought to be respectful to those that are around you. Amen. I mean, have you ever think about the time that you were not respectful to someone, and it's like it kind of haunts you, for lack of a better term? I remember it was probably 17 or 18 years ago, and I still feel bad about it. I really can't do nothing about it. I had bought a part at O'Reilly's here locally, and we had evacuated for a hurricane, and so I was in the Austin area. The part ended up not being right, so I took it back to an Austin O'Reilly's, and they told me they couldn't take it back because this isn't the one that you bought it at, and it annoyed me greatly, right? And I didn't completely, but I just expressed displeasure with it, and the guy was wrong. He got a manager, and he was a new guy, and he was wrong. But I know, looking back, I still know I didn't handle that well. Didn't treat the man with honor, right? Because even if O'Reilly wouldn't take it back, it wasn't like that kid sat in the office somewhere and made the rule up, right? This was completely above his pay grade at bare minimum. And we ought to treat people right, period. As a Christian, that's what we ought to do. Talks about loving the brotherhood. I think that this is definitely in direction to save people. I think there's a lot of application that can be made directly to your church. And I was thinking about this, loving the brotherhood. We need to make sure that as we think about stuff like this, not are people loving me like they ought, but am I loving people like they ought? That ought to be our goal here. It's just really, if I could just give you one phrase, I have quite a few here, but it's patient endurance of weaknesses. We're not, it's not a matter of, I'm just going to put up with all of y'all. Well, there is that essence of it, but that kind of attitude is not really what we're going for here. It's a love that we ought to want to have for it. It says, love the brotherhood. Talks about fearing God. And this is definitely, I think, an an arc imperative, right? It kind of overrides everything. Everything else we do, whether it's honoring all men, loving the brotherhood, love the brotherhood, honoring the king, all of it still has to fit under this fearing God aspect. And we have to put ourselves in the place in our minds that I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to follow God, whatever the cost may be. I will do it respectfully. I will do it submissively as much as I offend me. But when push comes to shove, you will have to throw me in the lion's den, right? And I will go there with my mouth closed, generally speaking. Say, well, it's not right. Yeah, I mean, I'm not even going to argue that, but we still have a response. I want to fear God more than anything, more than my boss, more than my family, more than anything in my life. I want to fear God. And he does talk about here at the end, honoring the king. Really, it's just recognizing the ruler's legitimate authority, obeying lawful requirements, paying your taxes, maintaining public order, refusing rebellion. We're strangers and pilgrims, shouldn't be causing trouble. As Christians, we shouldn't be causing trouble. And I think, again, Daniel does serve as an example. Daniel did spend most of his life in Babylon. He learned the language. He served its kings, worked within its government. He knew its laws, its customs, its people. And that really describes where we're at. But Babylon never became the final authority over his soul. I would argue that our goal as Christians, and I think Daniel is going to really paint a picture, especially the first 6 chapters, Daniel is going to paint a picture about serving the king without being defiled on the inside. And as a Christian, that is really the task. I'm a stranger and pilgrim. I'm going to interact in this world, but I cannot do it and be defiled. I appreciate your attention.